Welcome to Subcreation, the podcast that seeks and finds the divine in art, story, even muscle cars, and everything in between. Hello, I'm glad to be with you again. Welcome back. It's always a joy. This is our next episode of Subcreation, finding the divine in fairy tale stories, even muscle cars, because all of these are examples of the way that we as humans can participate in creation. As I've said in previous episodes, we take this whole idea, this concept of subcreation from J.R.R. Tolkien in his essay on fairy tales. So hopefully you're enjoying this perspective into looking at stories and fairy tales and movies, etc., so we can appreciate some of the hidden meanings therein and make better sense out of our own life. Today I want to look at the fairy tale called Hansel and Gretel, very common. This is a fairy tale that I always enjoyed. In fact, I remember when I was little, I had a friend who had the book, and it was so terrifying to see this witch whose only desire was to draw children in and eat them. And I remember in the storybook, not only did it show the outside of the house where it looked so delicious, made of all these pieces of candy to draw them in, but inside the house, I remember the oven and the big bird cage that Hansel gets stuck in by the witch, and she's hard of seeing, and so I remember the scene where she's feeling the chicken bone that he's handing her because she's waiting to fatten him up so she can eat him, and just how horrifying that scene was to me when I was so little, and it's with me to this day. That's the idea behind these stories, not to scare us so bad we carry forth these images, but so that we encounter something and discover something about that encounter that's teaching us something about our own real world. So that's our story today. I would like to look back at some of the themes we've discussed up till now to set the context a little bit, to put a better framework in place so we can understand this story of Hansel and Gretel, because I think this story shares similar elements to other stories, other fairy tales. You'll see similar elements in almost all the Grimm's fairy tales, but obviously elements that are unique solely to this story. When Tolkien talks about fairy tales, he mentions how they're not just for children, they're for adults as well, because we have this innate desire to connect with other creatures, including other animals. In our previous episode, when we talked about Snow White, we saw how Snow White is so pure and so innocent that even the animals of prey, like squirrels and rabbits and little tiny critters, felt comfortable with her. And she could communicate with them to a degree, maybe not speaking a full language, but they understood each other. And we have this desire for this. And so he mentions this desire to connect. And so the whole purpose of the story, of the tale, is to help us do that, to be a connector point into a realm that sure we recognize as fiction, or in this case fantasy, but it's not totally fantasy because it's operating with the same principles, the same underlying creative harmony or law of creation that governs our own creation, which he calls primary creation. Again, this is to teach us, to help us go from the fairy tale back to nature and this world and vice versa, and start seeing how the two interact. As we look at this story, it starts out like so many of Grimm's fairy tale stories start out. Now, near a great forest, there lived a poor woodcutter and his wife. There's always a great forest. Why? Why the great forest? We saw this with Snow White. She goes into the forest, it's scary, and finds this little cottage hidden away. Even in the Pied Piper of Hamelin, they escape through a forest into a mountain, into a cave. So we see this kind of use of a forest or of mountains or something mysterious to indicate that we're transitioning between one episode, one experience, and another. Authors call this liminal space. Woods, forests oftentimes symbolize liminal space. What is that? It comes from the Latin word that means threshold. So it's the threshold between not knowing and knowing, between what is and what is to come, between this realm and that realm. We're crossing over into something, and that crossover indicates adventure, but it also indicates mystery, wonder, and oftentimes danger. So when the story of Hansel and Gretel starts, we immediately see there's danger afoot. They live near a forest. Their father's familiar with it. He's a woodcutter. So the father's used to going in and out to provide firewood for himself and for the village, and to eke out whatever small salary he could to take care of the family. But we also recognize immediately that if he's a woodcutter, he's probably not very wealthy. And in fact, we're told they are poor. In fact, they're so poor, we're told that there is a great dearth in the land. The man could not even gain the daily bread. So because of the drought in the land and its inability to produce vegetables and gardens, even though he was cutting wood, he had no means to bring in food and income for his family. So the poverty was not due to the fact that he didn't have wood. They lived near a forest. It was due to the fact that the land wasn't producing. So the people he was trading with weren't able to give him anything for his labors, and he was stuck. Then we find out not only is this situation even more hopeless, but what makes it hopeless is the stepmother. So this image of the stepmother. Now, this is not a generalized statement on all stepmothers. This isn't denigrating all stepmoms. It's pointing out something, though, that when you're a new member of a family that already exists, when you're a husband marrying into a wife with children or vice versa, there's difficulty in that because there can be jealousy. We're recognizing that within this family there pre-exists creations, the children that I as spouse did not help create. Therefore, I know that there's a natural bond that they're going to have with their father or their mother that they will not have with me as their step-parent. And so if we're not careful, that can produce rivalry, jealousy, insecurities. And so the Grimm's brothers, as they're writing down these fairy tales, they usually include that element. That was a common element. They didn't invent that element. They just included it in all of their stories because it was a common element in the folklore. Death was so much a part of life that when one spouse lost another, they usually remarried. Women seem to get along better without their husbands than husbands get along without their wives. So that's why normally it's a stepwife, a stepmother who marries into the family. Women just figure out how to get along. They're much better suited to it than we men. If we lose our wives, I tell the joke, if I lost my wife, I'd be found 3 days later in the middle of my kitchen with a fork in one hand and an empty cup in the other. I wouldn't know what to do. So slight exaggeration, but it is true. Women provide this beautiful stability. But when you bring a woman in who's this new element, this new relational element that's foreign, that's not part of the created family that pre-exists, there's tension, and we immediately recognize it. And now, when we throw in these other elements, they're hungry. Their dad works hard. He has no way to gain any new food. He is stuck. Because with his profession is connected to professions that he has no control over. Namely, the land and the farming and whatever else resource could be produced. If there's a dearth, if there's a lacking in those resources, he's stuck. And then, of course, they live by the forest, by the wood, this liminal space, this threshold between what is and what is not yet, between what is known and what isn't known. Mysterious tension. So do you feel the tension? That tension's what creates the dramatic impact. That's what draws us in. One writer put it, he called it the knowledge gap. Because we have a gap now. Well, what's going to happen? Well, now I have to pay attention because I can't just walk away now because now I've got this unresolved tension that's been introduced to me by this story that I've got to figure out. So it's I don't want to call it a trick, but a technique that storytellers use to draw in the audience. Again, remember, we want to be drawn into another land, another realm that's not our realm, but that somehow shows us something about our realm, but that it allows us to connect to things that we can't connect to in our realm. So we're kind of willing participants in this. All right, so the story's beginning. So the stepmother then, she tells the dad, look, we can't feed these kids. She's got the excuse that she needs, and it's a legitimate excuse: hunger, poverty, famine, the dearth of the land, the danger, the reality that the future is very uncertain. And she tells the father, so we got to get rid of the kids. And they overhear. And the dad, of course, who has his natural fatherly love, he can't fathom that idea. But the wife, she persists. And the husband, like too many, was a little too weak and agreed, sadly, that he's going to have to lead Hansel and Gretel into the forest and leave them there. Then we see how Hansel calms his sister. He says, be easy, dear little sister, because they overhear this, and go to sleep quietly. God will not forsake us. So now we've got to introduce this whole idea of faith, this confidence that if our own human father is weak in the face of a foreign relationship that's entered in, who doesn't love us, we've got a God who does. And so we're going to see how this love, how this faith, this trust is going to unfold in the story. As the story continues, we see that Hansel and Gretel do get led off into the forest, but they're clever. So there's a cleverness to their secrets. Hansel picks up all these rocks that glisten, he notices one night in the moon. They put off a light, they reflect the natural light of the moon. He puts them in his pocket. So as they're led in the forest, he drops them one by one, spaced just right so he could see one from one to the next, and that they glisten so at night they can find their way home. So they're led off into the forest, he drops the rocks, they get ditched there, and yet they find their way back. And so when the stepmom finds this out, she's really angry. And so she begins to blame her husband, who he's trying to say, look, maybe this is a sign of God that they're supposed to be with us. He's pleading with her, but he doesn't know how totally to stand up against her based on it's the nature of the husband to want to lay down his life for his bride, but in ordinary circumstances that includes the children, because the bride is the mother of the children. Well, now we've got this strange situation. The mother doesn't want the children. And so the husband is torn between his natural desire to serve his bride and his children, but now there's a conflict there. So she's insistent and she blames, no, you've got to do this. You're too weak. This is why they found their way back. So he's got to do it again. All right, so this time Hansel's like, okay, so I can't get the rocks. She's on to me. But he grabs some bread. The dad allows them to have a little bit of bread. He shares a chunk with his sister. So we see in him, he's a good heroic figure. And so to the sister, and they're bonded together. If their bond of love doesn't extend to their parents, then it's got to extend somewhere and extends to them and from them to God. And they're led into this forest a second time. He's dropping the breadcrumbs. Unfortunately, the birds find the breadcrumbs. He was clever the first time, not as clever the second time. So when they get led into the forest, they can't find their way out. The birds have eaten up their clue to escape. This plan of escape to avoid the terrible fate that awaits them. So while they're in the forest and now they know they're stuck there, we are left to feel the terror that they feel. It's dark, they're lost, in trying to find their way home, they get more lost in this forest, this threshold between what is known, what is not, between what is familiar, what is mysterious, between what is safe or at least stable and what is unsafe or unstable. And that's where they are. So as audience members, as we're listening to this is where we are. And we've experienced this before. This is why we find it interesting. That what do you do when you're in such a situation? And we've been in these situations, maybe not quite to this degree, but I think we've all been in unfamiliar situations. First day of school, first day on a new job, first day in college, first time in a new setting, meeting new friends or maybe acquaintances we don't know, etc., where things are unstable and uneasy. And we want an escape route, and Maybe we've planned one beforehand and suddenly it doesn't work. What do we do? And this is where they find themselves. Well, because they're in this forest, and the forest is this space between what is familiar and unfamiliar, this is why there's oftentimes magic or special realities that are true only within the forest that aren't true anywhere else. What reality do they encounter? Well, they find, you guessed it, a cottage. They find a little house made of food, made of candy, made of things that they think look delicious. Of course, they don't realize this is the witch's house. So they begin eating. And the witch knows, hey, I've got this house set up for any lost little kid or anybody else who's going to find their way into this woods. I'm the one that takes advantage of the mystery of the space and makes it dangerous. The whole idea of the witchcraft has always been seen as evil. The word witch comes from the word Wicca or wicked, where we get the word wicked. It's the same root as the word used in a wicker basket. When you take a reed and you bend it in order to make a basket, that's the whole idea of wickedness, that you bend reality according to your power, according to your designs. Somehow you're replacing God, and you're going to do things that God wouldn't ordinarily allow. That's why it's wicked. You've set yourself up as a threat to this God who we've already heard they're placing their trust in. So now we see that this isn't just a struggle of physical sustenance. It's now become a spiritual struggle. And the witch represents not just physical death, but spiritual death. She represents an evil that goes beyond the mere fear of, say, a bear or a robber that could be waiting in the woods. That would be scary enough. No, this witch represents something more sinister, something kind of supernatural, something not normal, something extraordinary. There was a professor of C.S. Lewis's, his name was Rudolf Otto. He called that the numinous, the word he used for this supernatural fear that we can get. He described it this way. He said, if you're in a room and I told you there was a tiger in the other room, and you believed me, you'd be afraid. But if you're in a room and I told you there's a ghost in the other room and you believe me, you'd be afraid, but it's a different kind of fear. The kind of fear that people got from watching The Exorcist, they didn't get necessarily watching from Jaws, I realize. I'm dating myself, but those were two of the first scary movies I remember growing up. And they're both scary, but they're both scary in vastly different ways. So it is, this witch represents this numinous, this supernatural, or at least extraordinary power of evil. And sure enough, she lures the children in, and once inside, she closes the door and captures them. And she puts Hansel in a stable, in a cage, and Gretel she allows to serve her. And Gretel figures out that the witch is fattening up Hansel to eat him first. Now they are really stuck. They have succumbed to the trap. So they've got two foreboding nemesis, enemies in their life. Their stepmother, really their father too, who is weak in protecting them in their vulnerability, and this witch who's using the forces of the dark magic, the dark arts, to feed her desire to feed on young. This is something we see in ancient religions. This desire to feed the dark forces their children. It's horrific. It's horrible, and so even in folklore, because you're dealing with people who still are in touch with these ancient pagan religions, they may not believe them anymore. But the one thing the pagan religions of old had in common was they recognized that behind this world lay this deeper realm of the numinous, of some godlike forces that need to be appeased. And it's your job to appease the gods. And the more evil the god, the more evil the sacrifice needs to be, including your own children. And so we see this played out here. They're going to be a sacrifice to this witch. Now what to do? All their plans have failed. They've worked at first. They can't count on their dad. They've got to figure out some ingenuity. What happens is as the witch is going out and figuring out, she's hard of seeing, as I said, she's myopic, can only see up close. When she wants to pinch Hansel's finger to see if he's putting meat on him, he found a chicken bone in the cage and he holds it up and she feels it. She's like, oh, you're too bony still. And he uses that to postpone the inevitable while he and Gretel think of a plan. And Gretel realizes time's going to run out. The witch is going to figure out that he's not really holding up his finger, but a chicken bone that she's feeling and assuming that he's not putting enough weight on, and she's feeding him more to fatten him up for her dinner. So one day she's looking in the oven, and Gretel musters her strength, and she rushes upon the witch as she's looking in the oven and sticking firewood in there, and she knocks the witch in and closes the door. And the fire, it's more like a kiln. The fire that's already raging in the oven consumes the witch. This Christian image of what happens to the wicked in the end when they perish in the eternal flame. So she's pushed in and she dies. And now they're escaped, well, at least from her danger. They escape the witch. They take some food and put it in their pockets, but they're still lost. They have to find their way back. And that creates now a second drama. The secondary drama can show us that sometimes in life, when we think we've got something resolved, a wrench can get thrown in the works. And it takes a great deal of stamina and patience to accept that fact and counter it and work through it. And in this regard, they come to a river. Rivers, like woods, like forests, are liminal spaces. Crossing the river means you're crossing from one realm to the next, from what's known to unknown, or just like it can be from safety to danger, it can also be from danger to safety. It symbolizes rescue. A huge need in these stories. We need to find rescue. That goes with the heroism, but they don't know how to get across. I mentioned earlier this desire that Tolkien believed all humans have to connect with other creatures, not just other humans in other times and other places in other realms, but including animals. And sure enough, Hansel and Gretel find some ducks. Somehow they're able to communicate with these ducks. They're not ordinary ducks. They're able to connect with humans, at least children, and they safely get them across the river. How creation itself rises in a special way to bring about the safety of the children. These are themes that you get out of Judeo-Christianity. The wood of the tree provides the safety for the human race as our Lord uses it to perish and to bring us to everlasting life, etc. And so these natural creatures become supernatural in the way that they're used and in the function they have in the story. They get the children across the river. They find their way back home. They find out their stepmother has perished. So kind of a connection between her and the wicked witch, that the evil that's been manifested in this realm has now been vanquished. They find their father, he's happy, they're alive, he's consoled, and they live happily ever after. What Tolkien called the eucatastrophe, the happy ending. They lived happily ever after. He said this is a desire we have in all of us to not only endure the suffering, but to resolve it and to come to that place of peace, tranquility, and victory, where all the struggle and all the danger and all the sadness and all the wretchedness, all the wickedness is behind us, and now we can enter into a whole new realm because it shows the victory of this adventure, how we've had to go into the heart of darkness and come out and thus experience a new way of living. And so Hansel and Gretel, they accomplish that, they come through and they find their father. So oftentimes in these stories, the feminine represents not just receptivity, but it can also represent chaos. And the masculine can represent harmony. Again, not always, but this is how these writers in these tales produce it and show us these forces at work. So when the children destroy the witch, they're destroying this force of chaos. When their stepmother sends them out, and their father as well, because now they're sent off into the chaotic wilderness, they're open to temptation, because chaos brings that temptation without that stability. That's why they see the house and they want to eat it. But once they overcome that temptation, that sin, that evil that's in the world, Now they're able to restore order and come back together with their father and experience harmony. So we see that it's not just an adventure tale, but it's this tale of eucatastrophe, this tale of overcoming evil, this presence of evil, how it manifests, what it causes, chaos and temptation and enslavement, and then the victory that ensues by perseverance, by faith, and then how God uses other elements in their life, because they had faith in God to begin with, to get them out of it. So we read this and we feel better about life, especially if our life is experiencing some of these things, as all of our lives do. So this is the purpose of the fairy tale. And this is something that's instructive and enjoyable, not just for the child, but for the parent as well, and for the grandparent, and hopefully can lay groundwork for a way of pursuing a eucatastrophic life ourselves, a happy ending for ourselves. Well, thank you for joining me for this tale on Hansel and Gretel. Until next time, I'm Dr. Troy Hinkel. See you then.